Well, welcome to our Faith and Work, our Spring Faith and Work Forum. I'm Christy Yates, Associate Director at Theological Horizons, and I'm so excited to welcome you to another Faith and Work Forum. This is a chance to speak with leaders in our community who are experts in their field and learn more about how their faith interplays with their vocation. And it's also linked to our Fellows program, which I work with. And Alma here is a Horizons Fellow. She is graduating next month. She's from Durango, Colorado, and she's majoring in Global Securities and Justice with a minor in Russian Studies. And we're so excited to have Alma here, whose background and interest sort of overlaps a little with Rich's. And she's going to be interviewing Rich for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to conversation with the audience here and just see how it goes. But we're going to just start with a little, as our tradition is, a little moment of silence just to settle ourselves into this space. Amen. All right, I'm going to hand it over to you, Alma. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Christy. And thank you to Rich for joining me today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him, and then we'll get into our questions. So Rich Dean is a lawyer and a teacher. He graduated from Vanderbilt University in 1977, then earned his master's in foreign affairs and his law degree from the University of Virginia in 1980. For 42 years, he practiced law in New York, Australia, Russia, and Washington, D.C. He became the first American lawyer in Moscow when he opened an office there for his law firm, Kuder Brothers, in 1988. Rich has taught at UVA Law School since 1993, and he currently co-teaches two courses, Emerging Markets and Global Business International Corruption, both of which reflect the expertise and experience he developed from his legal work around the world. Recently retired from law practice, Rich serves as the co-chair and the board of directors for Coracle, an organization that focuses on biblical spiritual formation to equip people to live their faith effectively. He also serves on the board of End Poverty, an organization that provides capital and training to Christian entrepreneurs, primarily in Kenya, to assist them in building their small businesses. Over the last 4 decades, Rich has also taught extensively from the Bible, particularly the Old Testament prophets. His teaching has led to many opportunities for him to mentor young professionals, especially on issues of faith and vocation. So again, Rich, thank you for being with us. I just want to start out by asking you about 18-year-old Rich, who started at Vanderbilt, ground our conversation a little bit. What was your faith like at that point? What was your family like? And what were some of your career goals at the time?
So 18-year-old Rich, that was exactly 50 years ago. So
wow.
That's it was like a long time. Well, when I was about that time, I was entering Vanderbilt. My life goals at that point were I wanted to be a really good football player and probably go to law school, which was why I was at Vanderbilt. You know, I could play in the SEC, but it was a really good school. So, but I found when I got there, I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, so I was about 900 miles from home. Had a little hard time making friends. I was kind of introverted, and I got a D on my first college test. I still remember the test 50 years later.
What was it in? What subject?
History, European history. So anyway, let's not dwell. And then to top it all off, I threw my first college touchdown pass to a University of Tennessee linebacker. So that was, but you know, it's funny, I was up to that point, you know, I'd grown up in church. I was, you know, interested in the Lord and a little bit of a fellow traveler, but then you know, all the things that I had, you know, sort of used to prop my life up were kind of knocked out from under me. And I was embraced by guys who I really admired, other football players in the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and really drawn into that ministry. Ended up working for FCA a little bit after I graduated, and so it was a transformative experience for me. And as you know, I never made it in terms of that football career, but anyway, it worked out. So.
Yeah, it sounds like it certainly did. So after you graduated from Vanderbilt, so you worked for FCA, then you decided to attend law school at UVA. Tell us a bit about that, and then, just the first few years of your career as a lawyer.
Well, so for us, I didn't really imagine we'd end up at UVA. I was really interested in that time. I'd gotten interested at Vanderbilt in the Soviet Union. I studied Russian. I really wanted to, I was kind of conflicted as to whether I wanted to pursue an academic career, and I got into some other schools, but we ended up here interviewing, and I met a guy who was then the dean of students at the law school. Some of you know this name, Don Lemons, because he's now the chief judge of the Virginia Supreme Court. And Don introduced me to some people, and meanwhile my wife Sue was out looking for housing and happened upon a Christian couple. He's in the law school, had been Frank Rawls, we ended up taking their apartment, and but by the end of the day we kind of looked at each other and said, well, I think this sort of feels like this is where God wants us. So, and we never looked back. It was a wonderful experience for us in every way. And then we left here in 1980 and ended up in New York for 5 years. We went to New York with two other couples from the law school, really close friends of ours, and the hope was, it was wild at the time because you wouldn't remember this necessarily, but in around 1980, early 80s, interest rates were very high. The prospect of actually buying something in Manhattan, even though real estate was cheap in Manhattan, relatively speaking, the hope was the three of us would acquire a brownstone in Manhattan and use it for ministry. While we were each of us were in big law firms in New York, but so we stuck together for about 3 years. We ended up staying a couple of extra years, and then went to Australia from New York. So.
Australia, wow, great. Thank you for elaborating on that a bit. So Australia, eventually that you ended up in Moscow after that. And so I know you got there in 88, I believe, is that right? Yeah. And so 1988, tumultuous time in the Soviet Union. Can you just speak a bit about what that was like living there, especially with your family? And then also just given the climate of the Soviet Union and how it was to be a Christian in there.
So really, my wife, Sue, should be here because she was the hero of this adventure, because she agreed to go with 3 little kids, one of whom is sitting here. But my son, Peter, he was the number 2 in the pecking order. But so when we went to Moscow, Peter was 6, his brother was 8, and we had a 2-year-old daughter. So I can't, it's still inconceivable to me how Sue managed to do it all so well, but we were there as a family for 2.5 years. I stayed a little bit longer, and then we finally moved back to DC. But when we arrived over there, you're right, Alma, it was a crazy time. I mean, Gorbachev was in power, the Soviet Union was changing dramatically, at least on the surface, and it was, and every American CEO, now that the Cold War was over, wanted to be in Moscow to do deals. And so we were the only American law firm there, and so I saw a lot of these folks. But to get to kind of the heart of your question, we saw also a huge number of Christian organizations come into Moscow. And they were all, the big names. Campus Crusade was there, with a Russian version of the Jesus film, and Focus on the Family came, but the whole variety of ministries, and not so much the organizations I just referred to, but a lot of these organizations came in, and it was like, let's go have a photo op with a local orphanage, and they were like in and out, and it was, and they were, and I don't know if this has been like your experience, but I always think Christians should basically follow the law, but I ran into a lot who you think, well, God's called me to do this, if it violates the law, I mean, I'm serving a higher purpose. I'm thinking, well, yeah, but you could do jail time in Russia, so, you choose. But anyway, so we ended up, it was a little bit mind-boggling, but soon I ended up praying that God would just let us be part of something that had some permanence. Maybe God had no plans for Americans to do anything permanent, and American Christians to do anything permanent in Russia. But we just prayed, could we just be part of something? And two things emerged from that are still going on now, 30 plus years later. One is a seminary in Moscow that we've supported and been involved with for all this time, run by a Russian. And the other is a relationship we had with a guy who started a private Christian school in Moscow that ultimately was run out of business by the Russians themselves. But that's been a wonderful relationship we've had for all this time too. So it felt like, God really answered our prayers in the midst of all that. So.
Yeah, it's really cool to see how you're just doing work. You're working there. You're being a lawyer, but that's exactly what we're called to, right? Like, we work, and as we're going, we're living out the Lord's plans. We're working for Him too. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks for making that.
So, being a lawyer, as you said, there are opportunities for corruption, there are opportunities for vice, and Christians do break the law sometimes. But so what are some of the ways that you think that having that as your job, being a lawyer, have allowed you to grow in Christ-likeness? And then what are some things that you've particularly had to guard against because of temptations associated with that work?
Well, there's some obvious things in terms of growth. Like I was in private law practice with a law firm. So, if we do this well as lawyers, you're serving clients. It's not all about me. It's all about the client's interests, and sort of how. And those were good lessons in just how to serve in Christ. And then the other thing is, you don't really know from one day to the next where your next project is coming from. So you sort of learn a little bit of a walk of faith, like, okay, Lord, if you want me in this business, I've got to, earn a living. Where's the work going to come from? So those things. Now, on your question about advice, I mean, in the private practice law, you guys know this. I mean, we measure our time in 6-minute increments. I'm going to say that slowly because it's so profoundly ridiculous. So you're expected to count every 6-minute increment in your day. And at the same time, clients are billed based on time spent. This is the most insane setup. Why clients continue to accept it, I don't know. So you see the obvious pressure there is the more time you bill, the bigger the fees, the more profitable the law firm, all these things. And so in the midst of that, I mean, one of the greatest temptations is not, the challenge is to have integrity in the recording of time and stuff like that. That's just a very little thing. But then the other things are, there are lots of situations I ran into with clients where we were being asked to do something that maybe wasn't, exactly the right thing, and there's sort of a role of saying, well, look, I'm happy to represent you, but if this is the course of action you're going to pursue, we can't do that, and that comes up from time to time too. So
that makes sense. That's tough. Now, in those kind of situations, right? You're accountable to a higher power. You are have integrity because you're a Christian, and in that same vein, your work in general has allowed you to pursue some of the things that the Lord would have us pursue in the world, like justice, for example, as we talked about before. And Theological Horizons recently hosted Brian Stevenson, who came to UVA to talk about justice and mercy, and how his career as a lawyer allowed him to really see God's heart for justice and to work that out in our country. So how have you been able to kind of do the same thing through your career and really work on justice in your communities?
So, this I think is a big question. There are a couple of things over time I've learned. And this one piece of this, I mean, I guess there would be two big ideas. One is that I think one of the biggest challenges facing Christians going into the practice of law, where maybe you know, maybe you don't, and you don't care, but this is among the professions that people are least pleased with when they enter it. You know, if you poll lawyers, many lawyers hate what they do and all this. And I think part of the problem, obviously, is they don't see the big picture here. And at least for Christians, I think one of the challenges is, how do we see that law practice is actually worthwhile? And I think you have to take a step back and think about like how big God is and how completely his interest is in the world and what's going on. And it's a short step from that big idea to God cares about having a society where the rule of law prevails.
Right.
You know, you can enter into a contract and have some confidence it's going to be observed. These things God cares about. And so there's a sort of we ought to be thinking as we go into this, wow, I'm being called into this work that really matters to God. So that's sort of one piece of the story. The other piece is kind of how do we act in the middle of this? Once we're in the profession, what do we do? And this is where I think what Brian Stevenson was talking about. And by the way, how great is it to see a Christian, a dear brother who's in the middle of a critical issue in our culture and speaks into it with the grace and knowledge and integrity that he does. You know, it's what a blessing. You know, you want to kind of say, hey, look, culture, you're all upset with us as Christians, and we get some of this, but look at this. This is going really great. And pay attention here, because he's got something to say, and he's a Christian. You know? So anyway, that was wonderful. But this whole idea that Brian developed in his talk about taking on an identity for justice. See, this is so mostly when we move into our professions, at least I think in law, and it was true with me too. I mean, you move in, you think, well, how can I serve the Lord? Well, maybe I can participate in a Bible study in the office. Maybe I can witness to my colleagues. I should live a life of integrity, and I should be nice to people, right? That's kind of but I got challenged when I was a young lawyer by a guy. Some of you may remember he died sadly so prematurely, a guy named Tom Skinner, who people sometimes described as the Black Billy Graham. But when we moved to New York, we were introduced to Tom, and Tom used to have us into he had an office on 8th Avenue and 35th Street, I think, and we'd go up and sit, and he loved Arthur Treacher's fish and chips. He'd have Arthur Treacher's all the time. It was great. But then Tom would kind of mentor us and talk to us about stuff. And you may not remember this, but around that time, early 80s, the big crisis in American business, and we've had so many things happen since, but the big crisis was around the Ford Pinto. And this was the car that Ford designed with a gas tank in the back, and every time it got rear-ended, it blew up and people died. And Ford made the judgment that they were just going to deal with the claims made by people who were hurt, or families whose close family members have been killed in these cars, and not do anything about the redesign of the Pinto. Now that changed when juries began awarding huge punitive damages claims. And finally the economics. The economics sadly is such a driver. Anyway, so that was the Pinto story. But I remember saying in Tom's presence, very self-righteously, I would never represent Ford. I mean, who would want to work for an immoral company like this? And so Tom leans in, and those of you who remember Tom, he was about 6'2" or 3", and must have gone 260 or something, and he was a powerful, I remember him leaning in and saying, okay, that's what you say, but would it be different if you were in the boardroom? And so, that was like, wow, I got to think more broadly. I mean, this is like bigger than a little Bible study in the law firm or being a nice guy, or it's like I need to be attentive to issues that arise that I might have some impact on.
Yeah.
And sometimes these situations arose, and whether it was, fighting on behalf of a colleague for what I thought she was entitled to in the law firm, and they weren't giving it to her, or, things like that. I got later in my career, I got behind a woman who was a fabulous lawyer. I mean, in my world, especially in my last part of my world of corruption and crime, you always are thinking, what happens if I get in trouble? Who would I want to represent me? And there are only 2 people, and she was one of them. She was a fabulous lawyer. And the firm turned on her, and so I, moved to her side, and, that destroyed my position in the firm, but it was worth it. I mean, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but I felt like, this is what God sort of called me to do that was bigger than the more limited vision I had, which I owe to Tom Skinner. So
wow, that's a really cool story. Yeah. Someone said to me once, like, there's not a nursing stand, there's not a fire truck, there's not anywhere out there that doesn't need a Christian there, sitting there. And so I think that's a similar kind of thing. There's not a law firm that doesn't need a Christian.
Well, so this is the great thing, and this is the challenge that Brian gave us, I think, is sort of how do we, identify with justice? How do we get proximate to the marginalized?
Right, yeah.
What do we do? Look, what do we do as white people, who've had a lot of privilege? What do you do about, how do you diffuse a culture of fear and anger? I spent a lot of my time, I was telling somebody this morning that in the last 4 or 5 months, I've spent a lot of time talking to my peers, older white guys, about race issues. And it is stunning to me how hard that is. It's like exhausting just to get people to pay attention. Not everybody, of course, but just to get people to pay attention to this. And let's just learn the history. And then let's just figure out what the history was, first of all. And then now, even if you just say, now let's just focus on the present consequences of that history. And what could we as Christians be doing about this? And I think Brian Stevenson's, the role he's played in these criminal justice reform issues, particularly the death penalty issues, this is a huge model for us to think about, and how do we follow and get behind and support? So,
yeah, definitely. Thank you for all those thoughts. So, in the same vein, what advice would you give? You've been teaching at UVA for over 30 years. Been practicing law for even longer. What advice would you give to students who are heading into a career in law? And you've already said some of these things, but is there anything specific that you would have to say?
Well,
to
I
students?
would just kind of reiterate what I said. I got one of my students is sitting right here.
Great.
So Brian, thanks for coming. And it's like I've been speaking to you. It's but that's. I would just say these same things is remember that God's called you. I mean, and the story that I use that I find is sometimes helpful is, you remember when Jesus called Peter, when they've been out fishing all night and Jesus is, borrows his boat and does some teaching. Wouldn't it be nice to know what he was teaching exactly there, but we don't get that. And then, he turns to Peter and he says, well, take the boat out and fish. And Peter says, Lord, we get that you're a great religious leader. He doesn't say this, but that's what he's thinking. We know you're a great religious leader. We can see this. You're early in your career, and we're glad to be part of this. But we are the fishermen. And we were out there all night and there are no fish, right? But he says, and this is good on Peter, he says, because you said it, we'll do it, right? Like, we have no idea how this could possibly happen, but we'll be obedient. And of course, everybody knows the end of the story, right? The fish are, overflow the net. So, like, was Jesus just lucky? I mean, or did he just happen to know, like these guys now that take you out fishing with the radar equipment, right? They know where the fish. Did Jesus like just know? No, Jesus directed the fish, right? I mean, how does this happen? He calms the storm. He, stills the waters. He feeds 5,000 people with just a little bit of bread. There's something, at least this should remind us that Jesus is sovereign over the events of
Absolutely.
what happens in our little law firms or wherever we happen to be carrying out our work. And so, that's always kind of encouraged me a little bit. But this whole big idea, the whole idea that in whatever profession, so Brian maybe is going into law, but some of the rest of you, you're going into business, maybe you're going to be a journalist. God cares about truth. I mean, think of how our culture has been ravaged by falsehood, perpetuated by the media. I mean, what is happening, But so there's so many places now where if we get a big idea of what God cares about in the way He's working, we can play a role, Yeah. So anyway, I'm sorry, I get a little carried away.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's a really good point. That God made work before the fall. Our work is meant to serve Him, and so there's something that He cares about in all legal professions. So you're retired now. Can you tell us a bit about what you've been doing since you've retired? I know on the boards of two different nonprofits, and why you chose to be involved with those organizations.
Well, I've been involved with both of them for a really long time. One is Coracle. Some of you are familiar with this ministry. It really my involvement grew out of my personal relationship with Bill Haley, who's the founder, and he's an Anglican priest, I think a remarkable visionary. And Bill, sort of moved out of his role at the Falls Church and into this role as the director of this organization, which is a spiritual formation organization, but particularly focused on what we call kingdom action. But it's really sort of how are we formed in a way that leads us into what God cares about in inaugurating, in Christ the kingdom. And what can we do in furtherance of that? And so a lot of that work is in the area of racial justice. A lot of the work is in immigration, and in addition to being very solidly biblical, because it's often, I think it's hard in our culture now because everybody wants to quickly characterize something as, well, that's left of center, or that's liberal, or that's conservative. And Coracle is like deeply scriptural, and Bill cares as much about abortion issues and right to life issues as anybody. But the theory behind this organization is, we ought to care about not just those issues, but also the sort of cradle to grave issues that people have to confront, and how do you deal with injustice and that sort of thing. And poverty is a whole different approach. Actually, you did a nice job, Alma, describing the work of the organization, but it started as a microfinance organization overseas, and then has now gotten a little bit more focused on supporting Christian entrepreneurs who are building businesses to serve the poor and marginalized in Kenya. And we help them raise money and get training and stuff like that.
Yeah, and this is End Poverty. Yeah.
This is End Poverty, yeah.
Great. And so, and speak a bit about how you got involved with End Poverty, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah. So I was on the board of United Way International. You may remember that ill-fated branch of United Way that it became the place where the director of United Way parked all his illicit gain funds. But they were trying to kind of resurrect it, and I was on the board. It was a great organization, and but I rotated off the board, and I was looking for something, because by then I'd kind of, and I'm, you're all sitting here, and you're here for reasons that I don't have to tell you, that like somehow organizing your life in such a way that our time, some portion of our time, significant portion of our time, talent, and resources are devoted to the poor, and that was what United Way was all about. And so I had a good friend who was on this board, and I said, hey, I have some time. The only thing I'm, doing with my spare time is driving down to Washington Lee to watch my son play football down there. So, I could join this board. So that's how I ended up down there. I promised him I'd get him into the conversation. This is my son Peter sitting right here. So it's a very awkward thing to sit with a student, child, Rowena, who sits in our Hosea Bible study by Zoom, and my old friends Bob and Mike. So anyway,
that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I told Peter it's a good thing he was here because we knew nothing you said would be true.
Yeah, that's right. He's rolling his eyes back there. Yeah.
Well, we're almost, I want to turn it over to questions from the audience, so I'll just ask you one more. And you just mentioned the Hosea Bible study. So part of your bio is that you've been a Bible teacher for many, many years. Could you just speak about how that came about and what you've learned through doing that?
Well, I've spent a lot of time in the last 30 years, studying and teaching from the Old Testament, and I think the most obvious thing about the Old Testament is it's sort of the foundation for what we believe in the New Testament, and at least for me, and I think some of the guys who've been on this sort of journey with me, it's like you come away from a lot of time in the Old Testament with like a feeling of being much more deeply grounded. And we were talking earlier about like when you get to the prophets and go deep in the prophets, you realize that like we did a study for a long time on the book of Amos, and you see that Amos is really God's manifesto for justice, and God's heart so passionately committed to justice and so violently opposed to injustice, and you sort of look at how this all works together. But the thing that Rowena and I have been doing on Hosea, where everybody kind of knows Hosea as the book where God calls Hosea. It's the one calling that we all hope doesn't happen as Christian men, is that God says, go marry a prostitute and have children, and then she'll run away and you got to redeem her and bring her back. And we all think of Hosea that way, but we're actually getting to a part of Hosea now where the last few chapters of Hosea provide a foundation for understanding the pain God endured to have his son die for us. And this is like in the Old Testament. And we always look at it from a New Testament perspective. And obviously we've just been through, all that leads up to Easter, and have thought a lot about the crucifixion and the resurrection. But to see a picture in the Old Testament of God's broken heart for his sinful people, and yet his unwillingness to let them go, his commitment, is really, it's just wonderful. So this is what's coming, Rowena, when we get together on Friday. So.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Thank you. So at this point, if we have a microphone that we'll pass around. Christy has it. So we're just going to open it up to the audience for any questions. And thank you so much for answering all of mine, Rich.
I have a question or comment, if I might. I've done a lot of work in Eastern Europe. I've worked in Russia. I've worked in Afghanistan. Corruption is the order of the day. I mean, it's just the order of the day. And I would appreciate if you would speak more to how you avoid it. You don't get caught up in it because it's everywhere. It's literally everywhere. Until you mention about white men and how it's exhausting. I truly,
I'm sorry.
I
truly
get
no,
that.
for you, it's a whole different set of issues. I appreciate that. Yeah.
That's really important that you speak that. And I was here for that. I used to live here in Charlottesville. I've seen Brian Stevenson a few times, but I'd like for you, if you would comment more about the exhausted nature of the conversation with white men. And I'd also like to thought, as Christians, where do you do next? Because we go to these things, we have all these, and Brian Stevenson I think is great, but what do you do next? And I think for me as a black man, I think the onus is on white people. White people.
Well, I agree with that, yeah. So you've asked, that's quite a combination of questions. I've never gotten this, Okay, so quickly on their first part. So it was no accident that I spent 25 plus years working in the former Soviet Union and became an expert on corruption and money laundering, and spent the rest of my career doing that work. And that was because cultures where there's no rule of law, and it really is sort of raw power, and that translates into corruption in ways that are, it was hard. It was hard keeping clients out of trouble. We learned how to defend them when they got in trouble. But these are extremely difficult places where even the basic services, you want to get medical care for your child. You're going to have to bribe a doctor. You want your child to graduate from a prominent university. It's going to be a payment. I mean, and this is really, it's brutal. Yeah. But anyway, back to the other question. I mean, and here's how I feel. I sort of feel like when I'm in the presence of, your name, I'm sorry? Richard. Oh, good. Well, it's easy to remember for me. Thanks. Yeah. So, I'm always very hesitant because I feel like you probably have had to listen to a lot of white people unburden themselves with their guilt over these issues, and it exhausts you. So I agree with you that I think for me, the most important conversations I think I can have are with my peers, and those are conversations about, look, can we not talk about whether there should be reparations for every black person? Because that's always the quick and dirty, we're not going to be able to do this, it's ridiculous, let's not talk about it. Let's just talk about what the history was. And, which is, it's stunning. Little of it is known. I mean, and I learned this stuff when I was in high school. And so you see what the ravages of relentless white supremacy, have been in our country. And so let's just, as Christians, approach, and this is where I thought Brian Stevenson is so wonderful to talk about doing justice, the Micah 6 passage, do justice, love mercy. Approach these things with grace. I mean, if there were ever a reason for a lawyer to be embittered, it would be what Brian Stevenson's had to go through. Imagine, you remember the story he told when he talked about his guys, this work that he's done to finally the Supreme Court said, you can't sentence a 14-year-old kid to life without parole anymore. And a lot of guys got off. But remember he told the story with President Ryan. He said, I'd just gotten out of a circuit where we'd been through the retrial and the judge resentenced him. And he didn't. And you think, how many times are we going to have to go through this stuff? But anyway, I just think the whole approach from a Christian standpoint, we have the tools to work in this culture because it's, Christians don't have to cancel Thomas Jefferson, right? Because we can understand that a guy could be gifted and have brilliant ideas about the organization of government, but still be, like us, desperate sinners and enslave people and not think twice about taking advantage of a woman and having children. It boggles the mind. But the only cultural response we have is, okay, I know he hasn't been canceled here yet, but it's not over. To cancel people like this. So everywhere, names are changing, history is being wiped out, and it doesn't really advance things in a way that is meaningful. So let's talk about what are the present consequences of persistent racism. So it's health, education, jobs, all of these things. And what can we do as white people with resources to respond? And as you direct us, as you do, it's not me figuring out what you need. I mean, we're not talking personally here. This is a big thing, right? But it's me saying to you, Richard, how can I come alongside you and your community and bring what I have to offer and serve you? How about that? So that's, yeah.
And I think truth.
Yeah.
We need truth.
We need truth.
We need truth
Yeah.
more than we need anything else. We need truth.
Yeah.
And
Thank you
we've
for saying
lied
that.
for 300 plus years. I grew up in this town. Racism is alive, it's well, And I think Ryan really missed it, personally. I think he really missed it. I think he asked Brian Stevenson, what should we do? And Brian Stevenson said, we train people, we do these things. He offered reasonable suggestions. And I think the president could have embraced it much more so and said, we want to be a part of this. We want to be a part of the change because we are the university and we want to speak truth to power. And I think there was an enormous opportunity that was missed.
Well, maybe it's not missed. Maybe the university can grow into this.
The clock is ticking, Richard.
Well, you and I, for right. I know. I feel like, come on, Lord. Well, only a few years left. I mean, can we make some headway here? Yeah.
I have a personal question. I'll preface it with a word. I started my medical practice in the poorest county in North Carolina, extremely racist back in the 80s. I used to run 10 miles through the cornfields just to try to get rid of my anger. So the question to you, sir, is how do you deal with that personally? I don't have a good answer for myself. So I'm really asking for myself, how do you deal with what you see and what we hear?
Well, I probably haven't seen what you've seen, up front, so close. Look, I don't know any other way to deal with this than just, be at the feet of Jesus, asking for grace, mercy, remembering that this brokenness that led to white supremacy, behind all that are human beings made in the image of God. Fallen people for sure, but how do we speak truth, but also mercy and grace into broken people? You probably thought that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, because obviously lawyers have to defend, guilty people too, people who have, violated God's commands and just done bad things. How do you reconcile, following Jesus, but also defending people who are not doing so? And
like really bad people.
yeah.
Can you
How do
defend them
I?
or, you want to answer? No. Okay. So look, here the whole system works. Our system works on the theory that everybody's entitled to a lawyer. In other words, if you're accused of a crime, the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, right? You're entitled to a defense. Now, it has to be a defense grounded in truth. You can't lie about on behalf of your client and all that kind of stuff. But you're entitled, and in fact, the system doesn't work that well unless you have good defense lawyers who are raising these issues. To reverse your argument, your point a little bit, you see these horrible situations. This is what Brian Stevenson's been fighting his whole career, is because he doesn't deal with these people in the beginning. It's not. I'm sure he's had some, but he's an appellate lawyer, and so what he inherits is a situation where a guy has been condemned to death row. He had a lousy defense lawyer. He had a prosecutor who was probably elected locally, and didn't want to be seen as not being tough on crime, and a judge who didn't care, and that pattern has been repeated time and time again. So the system breaks down entirely when that happens. Now, let me just say to you, I do believe, no matter how heinous your example could be, you figure out who you want to use, Adolf Hitler, whoever you want to, Osama bin Laden, is that person still entitled to a lawyer in a legal proceeding in the United States? Absolutely. And should the lawyer work hard to present his defense? Yes. I haven't convinced you. I've never convinced my wife of this. We argue about this issue all the time. How could you come on, anyway. But that's the answer, is the way our system works. Having strong defense counsel presenting all the defenses that this person's entitled to, makes the system work better. It's not a perfect system, but it's. Yeah, Bob, you want to help me on this? Because it's, yeah.
Well, are you going to follow up on that? Yeah.
Bob's better on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm better than Rich, but I taught legal ethics for 40 years, and I don't know that my I don't know that my answer's any better than it was 40 years ago. But first off, a wonderful quote from an ethics professor, Monroe Friedman, who said that if you don't want to represent people who lie, cheat, and steal, don't go to work for big corporations. But anyway, I think that's too cynical for me. I much prefer Tom Skinner's advice to Rich. But I like to think of lawyers like Brian Stevenson and lawyers like Rich Dean as both pursuing justice, but in different ways. Brian Stevenson pursues it directly. He thinks nobody should receive the death penalty for what they've done. And I mean, he represents people who have done the most heinous things. It's not just breakdown in the system. I mean, he's representing, people who have, done the worst things you could imagine, and of course tries to find reasons to understand that. And he's opposed to the death penalty under any circumstances. I think of Rich and most lawyers as pursuing justice within a system where they play a role. I like to use the story. There was a Christian gal who wanted to be an actress, and she got the opportunity to be in Les Mis. She was the age of some of you in this room, and she was in Les Mis going to play the young Cosette in the traveling version, not the Broadway version, but the one that followed it. And then she realized that as a part of playing Cosette, I mean, she would play Cosette when the sort of teenage Cosette was present, but that because this traveling group had a small number of actors, she would also have to play a prostitute in the prostitute scenes, and men would sort of grab at her, and she'd be in revealing clothing. And so she decided as a Christian that she couldn't accept the role, even though that's the dream role of any young actress. Well, I like to ask law students, should she have accepted that role? And that we kind of wrestle around with that with a little distance, that we don't have when we're talking about lawyers. And at least my advice to her, I think she would of course have to deal with it personally and how it would affect her personally, but standing back from it as to whether that would be a good role to play, even playing the role of a prostitute in the play, I think it would be a good role to play because of the ultimate outcome of the play. I mean, it's a message of justice. I mean, it's a Christian play or musical, but it works because people play their roles within the system. And it seems to me the analogy fits, that a lawyer in some ways is an actor within a role. You're making an argument. You recognize that other people are making contrary arguments. And the ultimate outcome, I think, is justice, hopefully, if you've got a system that generally yields justice. Now, in this fallen world, we don't have perfect justice anywhere, but I think generally the advocacy system we have in the United States is a good one. So
Answer your question.
I think generally it's a good system. That is the advocacy system in trials. I realize it's not a perfect system. I mean, I've spent my life writing, trying to correct aspects of it, and I think we all need to correct aspects of it. I think that's part of the advocacy system. You point to the injustices and you try and get people represented, when they don't have a right to a lawyer. You try and enable women to bring rape charges against their husbands when, they can't bring rape charges. I'm just pointing to things that have changed over the 40 years that I've been around.
The challenge with that is that the system is broken. Poor people, black people, women, it's abundantly unfair to them. And the advocacy portion doesn't work for poor people and black people because too often they don't have the resources to get an advocate who can be a forceful advocate. And the racism is throughout the system, and it's been here forever. And so the challenge, when we talk about Christ, it seems to me, injustice is how long? King said, how long? How long must black people wait? My grandmother lived to be 100 years old in Stannisville, Virginia, went to Calvary Baptist Church, prayed all her life. She died, she was still praying. How long must people wait for this justice? And that is our challenge. So, white people, again, when I hear people say the system is fair, I know a whole lot of people who've been in the system. I volunteered in a prison. It was not fair to a lot of people. And I think that when we say it's fair, it's relative to the eyes that often how we see it. This country that we live in, racism is real. And it's not just real 100 years ago. And so the people, there's a church on every corner. And I think we need to speak to that. What God are people praying to? God of justice and mercy?
And I don't disagree with anything that you say. But I think the question then is, what do you do? And I think the system that we've got is better than any obvious system as I look around the world. And I think there's a lot that's wrong with it. There's a lot that ought to be challenged about it. I get together once a month with a former client for dinner, African American, lives in the projects here in Charlottesville, and I realize he sees the world very differently. He's experienced the world very differently than I have. When I see a police officer, I'm sort of relieved there's safety here. When Sydney sees a police officer, he feels like he's got to calm that officer down. The system's screwed up. I'll push back on you a little bit, though, and I'll push back on a lot of the rhetoric that's going on now where people speak in terms of whiteness. If you want to get people's backs up and get them to where they're not listening, speak in those kinds of terms. Deal with it issue by issue. Lay out your case, but labeling somebody white and therefore racist, it seems to me, just perpetuates the problem, drives people to the dark side. I don't guess I need to identify what I think the dark side is. Anyway, pass it over to Mike.
Time for one more question.
I'm going to change the subject. You talked early on going to Vanderbilt,
beginning to understand what your faith was about. Adversity caused you to move in that direction. But by the end of what you said, it was clear that God had intervened in your life, and that every aspect of what you did was focused on honoring Him and being who He wanted you to be. And especially for younger folks, you hear people spend a lot of money to go to business people spend a lot of money to go to big seminars to hear how to be a Christian and be a businessman too. In my mind, that should be a natural thing. I mean, going back to the Bible and what the Bible speaks on. But as you transitioned, how would you counsel younger folks to understand that it's not just about Sunday? It is about being who God wants you to be in every circumstance.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I thought you were going to ask me to talk about my football career a little bit, but sadly, be a short conversation. Yeah. Look, I think this is a kind of a question of formation, and I would just counsel folks who are growing up and going into these professions, and whatever, even here at the university, to be sort of thinking about a God who's sovereign over all of history and the events of human beings, and how am I now to live my life in light of that? Sovereign, but also loves me and cares about me and has a role for me to play, and to think creatively about what that role could be beyond just a kind of a very limited thing that our generation, I feel like, of white guys has sort of gotten into, which is I'll give you an example of this. I was teaching a Bible study not long ago with a bunch of guys like me. And we were studying 1 John, and the part of 1 John when he says, this is how you'll know God, and that is if you love one another. And so I said, so think about the way we were formed spiritually in our generation. What would you say, would have been the distinguishing factor? In other words, what would it have meant to know God in that, And most of us were like, well, do you have a regular quiet time? Are you active in Bible study? You're participating in church? But that's not what John says. John says, if you love one another, and we've been kind of weak on that. So that's the way I would encourage him. I don't know if that's exactly the direction you were going with that, but yeah. I'm not sure what direction. Well, yeah.
Kelly, you want one last word?
Well, just a question. As I've been listening to you, I'm Kelly Epley. I live here in Charlottesville for about 30 years. I work at Habitat for Humanity. We like to think what we're doing is housing justice. And we try to articulate ourselves in terms of that. But as I hear you speak, I've been trying to place labels on you. Yeah. Because we do that, right? We're in a land of labels. That's how we define people. And I'm wondering how you describe yourself. Because would someone call you conservative? Would they call you progressive? Would they call you liberal? Would they call you whatever? And I'm just, because I see you as a follower of Jesus, and I hear you use that language, but you're in a world where you could be called a lot of things.
I think that's happening to me, actually, weirdly. I mean, I feel less at home in certain circles. I feel like in certain circles they're less interested in having me around, I don't know. It's a really good question. I don't know how I would, because I don't like these labels of, it's easy to say, well, I'm a progressive Christian, right? Because and some of us, there's some, what does that mean exactly? I don't, I would have, a few years ago just said, look, I'm an evangelical. I still think I'm kind of an evangelical. And that I think the basic tenets of believing in the Bible, the need for conversion, personal experience with Christ, all that are really all true. But I think where I've come to on this is like, we as white evangelicals have lost touch with God's great heart for justice issues. And why then, once you say that, it's like Bill Haley didn't originate this saying. I think it comes from a Catholic priest in Latin America who says, when I talk about taking care of the poor, everybody's excited. But when I talk about changing the systems so that we have less poverty, I become a socialist. Right. Yeah. See, this is the thing, and I think it's going to take a determined effort by Christian people to move into these hard areas. I have a black pastor I've gotten to know well. We've become good friends, and I think about a comment he said to me long ago. He said, "Look, the work that needs to be done now is really hard, and I don't know if white people are really willing to undertake this hard work, you know." And anyway, I don't know if that answers your question very well. I think I sort of kind of dodged it, but yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. One, we want to keep going. We have a lunch tomorrow with Eddie Howard, the Executive Director of Abundant Life Ministries, here at 1 o'clock. And then Karen also has another announcement of an event. Mm-hmm. And she's going to give our final blessing.
Thanks, Christy. Thank you, Rich and Alma. It's so rich to hear this conversation and to really get into the details of how you live your life and how you see the world and how you see God in it. Yes, so come back tomorrow at 1. Eddie Howard, who's the Executive Director of Abundant Life Ministries, is going to speak on sustaining the soul of equal justice. He has a rich history, a lot of different experiences. He's a native of Charlottesville, so we'll be right back here for lunch tomorrow at 1. And on Sunday, our community partner, St. Paul's Memorial Church, is hosting their annual Koinonia lecture, and Dr. Reverend Willie James Jennings is going to speak on dismantling racial faith. That's at 4:30 p.m. at St. Paul's. I've left some flyers there on the table, but Dr. Jennings is a professor of systematic theology and Africana studies at Yale University Divinity School. He has written a book called The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, and he wrote an interesting commentary on the book of Acts and a book called After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging. So very much in line with a lot of the conversations we're having. And so I love the fact that we have a scholar, we have a lawyer, we have a local leader, all coming this week to enrich this conversation after Brian Stevenson. I'll also point out 2 resources that we've printed for you. They're on the table. One is a 2-pager on looking forward, steps for further learning and action that Maggie Rosberg, our law school friend, has created for us, that I would invite you to ways to learn and lead and get involved. And another sheet that she put together on the theme of sustaining the soul of equal justice. It has some really terrific quotes and a prayer, a liturgy of lament from Cole Arthur Riley from Black Liturgies. Anyway, our hope is just that, this is such an ongoing and complex kind of set of issues. And our hope, of course, is that each and every one of us will find a way to learn and to become more deeply committed and to take action as we change ourselves and step into the world as God leads us. So I hope that you'll engage as you can. It's our tradition to say a blessing at the end of every gathering with Theological Horizons, and I will offer that now. May the Lord Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Amen.